Hello. So in this video, I'm going to talk about one of the top two most misused terms in psychology, bipolar disorder. The other term being narcissism, and I'll make a video about that at some point later. But I'm going to talk about why people show up in therapy and say, I'm bipolar, or why people say, my wife is bipolar, my dad is bipolar, things like that. Often when they're not really talking about true bipolar disorder and what it often points to and why it makes a difference, whether it's actually bipolar disorder or not. Stay tuned. Welcome to Wellness with John. I'm John Peters, and these are resources to help you thrive. So in this video, I'm going to talk about bipolar disorder. And the reason that I'm making this video is because bipolar disorder is something that people often self-diagnose or, as lay practitioners shoot from the hip and diagnose their family members. And sometimes people kind of adopt this idea that they're bipolar or that someone they know is bipolar. And then they use that as a vague term to point to something that's not true bipolar disorder. And this actually matters, which is what I'm going to explain. But let me start off first and say that this video really isn't primarily aimed at helping you diagnose yourself with bipolar disorder. It's an educational video where I want to inform you about what we practitioners think about what differentiates bipolar disorder from other things. And if you think that you may be actually having bipolar disorder or someone you care about, the best thing to do is get competent evaluation. Also, if you're currently in a crisis, the best way to get immediate help would be to call 988 or to go to the nearest emergency department for evaluation and treatment. Okay, so I'm making this video because I've been a therapist for over 25 years. And one of the things that I've noticed is when people come into therapy and we're asking about their history, right, so that we can have some context to understand whatever it is that they're presenting with, people will often say among their past diagnoses that they're bipolar. And when people give family history, people will often say that someone in their family has bipolar disorder, right? And so when we ask questions that actually point toward the features of actual bipolar disorder, um, quite a lot of the time, right? I don't have data to say exactly what percentage, a very big part of the time, what people are actually describing is not bipolar disorder, right? So bipolar disorder is bipolar, meaning that it goes in two directions instead of unipolar, which would be depression. So when someone has periods of depression, then we call that a unipolar depressive disorder because they're normal part of the time, and then some of the time they're depressed, which is a divergence from whatever normal is, and their features of depression. And some people do have periods of depression, but also have periods of mania, or a milder presentation of mania, which we call hypomania. Okay, so mania is an episode where for most or all of the day, for a number of days, you have three or more of the following features, right? So inflated self-esteem and grandiosity, increased talkativeness, racing thoughts, decreased need for sleep, increased distractibility, increase in goal-directed behavior, so starting new projects, getting very intensely focused on projects or new goals, and often increased engaging in risky behaviors that have a high risk for negative consequences, like charging up huge amounts of money on the credit card, right, or other types of risky behaviors. So there are these 7 features of mania, and Again, if someone is going to get the true diagnosis of bipolar disorder, then at some point in their history, they have to have had at least one episode where they had three or more of those symptoms that lasted for a week, for it to be a manic episode, or for 4 days if it's going to be a hypomanic episode. And one thing that is very important to consider is that even when people have some familiarity with what those actual features of mania are, it's often still a misdiagnosis for people to say, well, then this person's bipolar, because those features have to show up in a discrete episode that are marked divergence from their normal pattern. So, for example, if someone is just generally talkative, that's kind of their baseline normal personality, then that's not really going to count as a feature of a manic episode because it doesn't represent a divergence from normal for them, right? We count these features, for example, racing thoughts and talkativeness, if that's not that person's baseline status, right? So a manic episode is when someone was functioning a certain way and they have a remarkable change so that for a period of time they look different than they normally do, right? So this is something that people kind of miss because some people just have grandiosity, or have some inflated self-esteem and things like that, or don't sleep well in general, just don't sometimes people have chronic sleep disturbance and seem, compared to the general population, to sleep less, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're manic, right? But if you have a person who normally, let's say, sleeps 7 hours a night, and then for a week they sleep 2 hours a night, then yes, we would count that as a divergence from their normal pattern, and we would say that is reduced sleep that could be a feature of a manic or a hypomanic episode, right? So basically, if we are talking about true bipolar disorder, then in the person's history, we have to find at least one episode of mania or one episode of hypomania, kind of regardless of the course of their depressive episodes, right? So this is an issue partly because the main point of this is that sometimes people are saying that they're bipolar or that someone they're close to is bipolar. And what they really mean is that the person is labile. When someone has labile moods, then that means that their moods are kind of up and down. And one of the ways that we differentiate lability is that the lability tends to point toward a lack of coping, someone being overwhelmed with stress, or someone being, sometimes people have deficits of emotional maturity, or, they have toxic emotional regulation. And so it is a common issue that you see people who, one minute they look fine, and the next minute they're over the top angry, right? And there are lots of people with anger management problems who aren't bipolar, right? There are lots of people who don't manage their emotional lives well who aren't bipolar. There are lots of people who just don't cope well with stress, and their moods are all over the place when they're stressed out, and they're not bipolar, right? And why is this an important distinction? Well, number one, if a person is truly bipolar, they need to get competent treatment. If the person is not bipolar and we're looking at these other types of things, we're going to do a very different type of treatment, right? And so this is one of the reasons it's useful to understand that there is a difference between true bipolar disorder and the other things that people commonly just call bipolar. One of the issues with bipolar disorder in terms of valid diagnoses of bipolar disorder is that, unfortunately, in the grand scheme of things, it's one of the most poorly managed issues in psychology. There was a study done one time, for example, where they took people who had a valid diagnosis of bipolar disorder, and they did a retrospective review of their history to figure out when did they think, when can we see that the symptoms first came on, and how long was it before they first experienced symptoms of bipolar disorder until they eventually got competent treatment and became more stable. And in this study, the people that they interviewed, they found that on average, a person with true bipolar disorder goes 10 years with symptoms before they get a competent diagnosis and competent treatment that helps them improve their functioning. So that's not great news for people in general, unfortunately, which means people go a full decade with obviously symptoms that really impair functioning and make people miserable before they get competent treatment. And I think, the part of the reason for this is lack of good knowledge about what bipolar disorder really is. And I think that also when someone is manic, they are often likely to not have good insight into the fact that they're manic, and so that makes them not likely to go seek help. Mental health issues in general have stigmas that cause people to not want to go seek treatment, or people may have had some failed treatment that caused them to become pessimistic about whether or not further treatment would be of a benefit, right? So, I understand there are lots of reasons why people don't end up getting good evaluation and treatment, but unfortunately, it is the case with bipolar disorder that a lot of times people go for a long period of time without getting diagnosed and getting treated. Now, one of the reasons that the treatment is different between true bipolar disorder and these other things that we sometimes call bipolar disorder is that when someone has true bipolar disorder, even though we do see the episodes of mania and the episodes of depression being more likely to occur during periods of higher stress or when there's some sort of acute kind of stressful situation that the person's having trouble coping with. So stress seems to play a role in precipitating an episode, but the features of the episodes often are not really highly congruent and directly cued by whatever the actual thing is that's happening that the person is coping with. So let me say that a different way because that's kind of a complicated concept. So, if someone is, let's say someone's actively manic and they're having these, 3 or more of those symptoms that I talked about earlier, and we try to connect the dots between any one of those types of symptoms to what the person has recently been experiencing, it often just doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. And so, when you look at the onset, the person is relatively normal for whatever normal is for that person, and then they have a change. We can sometimes point to stressful events that are associated in time with when that change occurred. But really, when you look at it, it kind of seems like the universe is willy-nilly just dropping the episode on the person, there's something kind of chemical that's just kind of precipitating the divergence of their functioning. And because of that, then we don't necessarily think that what we need to target is the circumstances in order to prevent the episode. If we thought that manic episodes and depressive episodes were always with everybody completely a reactive kind of situation to life events and experiences, then yes, we could say, yeah, we can reasonably expect that we can control them by controlling how well someone is coping with complicated and challenging life events. But in the case of bipolar disorder, it's kind of willy-nilly and just random, even though certain conditions, certainly, certain health conditions can promote symptoms that look like mania or actually potentiate a manic episode. But that's one thing that's different from these other things that we kind of point to. Because if you take someone who is, let's say they have an anger management problem, then in the moments when they're angry, we can pretty well connect the dots between the quality of their mood, anger, and whatever it was they were experiencing right in that moment that triggered the anger, right? Now, again, it may be a toxic or dysfunctional anger response. Maybe the person isn't good at regulating their emotions or coping with stress. But the thing is that the quality of the experience and the reaction that the person has to the event makes a lot of sense when it's not bipolar disorder. That's one of the ways that we kind of differentiate mania versus, let's say, poor mood regulation, right? So basically, there is such a thing as bipolar disorder. The prevalence rate, depending on what studies you look at, say that in the adult population in the United States, anywhere from like 2.5 to 4.5% of people actually meet the criteria for true bipolar disorder. However, the problem is that way more than 5% of people show up in therapy and say they're bipolar or say that their family member is bipolar. If you take people's reports of this kind of misguided diagnosis of bipolar disorder, like 40% of the population, I don't know, a really large percentage of people show up with saying that they're bipolar when they really aren't, right? It's way more than 4.5%. So this is one of the reasons that we know that this is skewed, is just the prevalence of people saying it, given the actual data that has surveyed the general population and what we know the prevalence rate actually is. Now, another thing to consider about bipolar disorder, and one of the reasons that we do ask about family history, is that there is a hereditary component with bipolar disorder and mood disorders in general and anxiety disorders. So if you have a family member, a direct close relative who has been diagnosed with true bipolar disorder, that does make it more likely that it is actually the case that you have true bipolar disorder. But it doesn't mean that you're fated. Like if your mom had bipolar disorder, it doesn't mean that you're fated to develop bipolar disorder yourself. Another reason that it's important to differentiate the bipolar from not having bipolar is that it does matter to your medical doctor or your psychiatrist in terms of what types of medicines that they might treat a person with, because they don't want to give you, let's say, antidepressant medicines that are ignorant of the fact that you have, let's say, family history of bipolar disorder, and then run the risk of inducing mania, right? Now, doctors don't always know this, right? And they don't have a God's eye view, so they just have to make the best guess that they can. But again, the best evaluation is based on the best actual history of the patient. And this is one of the reasons that practitioners who are evaluating psychiatric issues try their best to differentiate true bipolar disorder from things that get called bipolar disorder, right? So anyway, hope this information is helpful to you. If you like this kind of content, hit the like button below. And if you have yet to subscribe to my channel, please subscribe to support the growth of this channel. I'll keep making videos on topics related to therapy and anxiety and psychiatric issues and stress relief and things like that. So stay tuned for the channel. And one last thing I want to share with you before I sign off is my channel is not sponsored by anybody, but I do offer additional services. If you want information, you can check the description below. But one course I offer is a stress reduction mastery course, which teaches you easy to learn, easy to practice techniques to quickly and lastingly lower your stress response. So if you want more information about that, check the link in the description below, and that'll jump you over to the information page about that course. The good news about that course is I've taught that material to thousands of people. Therefore, I know it works. I'm so confident that it works that if you take the course and you don't have lower stress within 2 weeks, I'll just give you your money back. It's 100% guaranteed, so can't lose. So anyway, thanks for joining me in this video today. Be sure to like and subscribe, and I will see you in a future video.